Most of us lack the gracefulness of a seasoned public speaker or professional athlete, but we can still live a grace-filled life by cultivating the 4 cardinal virtues. And we'll talk just about that tonight, so please stay with us. Thank you. Welcome, my Father, Mitch Pacwa. Welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from all over the world. Before we get to our guests, just want to mention that today is the 98th anniversary of the first apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Fatima in Portugal. And this is a very important message for the modern world, a lot of warnings to the modern world, which many in the modern world are not paying attention to. So we definitely need the intercession of Our Lady of Fatima because of the problems we have in Western culture and its, in many ways, some of its declining elements. Also, as the late servant of God, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen had said, that this is also a great source of devotion for us to seek to have reconciliation and bring peace with Muslims. Something very important is still many of our brothers and sisters are being hunted down and martyred right now, still in large numbers. So let's ask Our Lady of Fatima for our brothers and sister Christians, and especially in the Middle East, who are victims of Daesh or ISIS and other groups. Tonight, we do have 2 guests. 2 of them are my very good friends and old friends, and they are very familiar to all of you. They were last together on the EWTN series called Priests and Deacons, where they discussed the blessings and challenges of living out the vocation to ministry. Now they're at it again. They're here at the network working on a brand new miniseries called Grace-Filled Living. They are examining the 4 cardinal virtues and how they influence our thinking and our lives. So please welcome Father Brian Mullady of the Dominicans and Deacon Harold-Burke Sivers. Deacon.
Hey, Father.
Father Mullady. Well, it's wonderful to have both of you here, and this sounds like a very good series. But seeing as how you talked about the priests and deacons, why are you talking about the virtues that the cardinals need? Is that what you're doing?
That's good, Father.
I just was wondering, cardinal virtues, what problems do you see that Pope Francis doesn't? Tell us more.
Well, the reason why we're doing this series, we had such positive response from priests and deacons, and Father Mullady and I are friends. I mean, we both live in Portland.
Yes.
And when he was
Portland, Oregon.
Not the other
That's
Portland.
Right.
That's right. So when Father was assigned to live at the Dominican Friary there, we started getting together because we both travel. And when we were both in town, we just get together and just have some fraternity and friendship and just talk about things. And out of that, our discussions came the idea for priests and deacons. Mm-hmm. Well, we got such wonderful response. We said, well, let's do something else. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that Pope Benedict started to write a trilogy of encyclicals on the theological virtues.
Right.
Faith, hope, and love. So he wrote Deus Caritas Est, God is love first, then Spe Salvi on hope, and he was working on Lumen Fidei, the encyclical on faith, when of course
he resigned.
He resigned, and then Pope Francis completed that encyclical. Was released under Pope Francis. So in looking at that, we saw that there wasn't enough attention, we thought, being paid to the cardinal virtues. Mm-hmm. And when we look at what's going on in our culture today, the moral relativism, the individualism, subjectivism, all these different things going on. We see people aren't really paying attention.
Yeah, these are various philosophies to try and give intellectual justification for avoiding living a virtuous life.
Exactly. And so to counter that,
Yes.
we thought it'd be a great idea. Why not do a mini-series? It's a mini-series because there's only 4 cardinal virtues. So we're going to do 13 episodes on 4. So what we decided to do was do the first episode looking at virtues in general,
Okay.
and then looking at each of the 4 cardinal virtues in the order that they're presented in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance.
All right, so I was going to ask, because this is one of the great genius insights of St. Thomas Aquinas from your own order, Father, that to understand moral theology, you begin with the virtues, which is very different than later developments that began sort of from canon law and a legalistic approach.
Exactly.
St. Thomas was much more focused on the virtues.
Exactly.
What is the difference, just in essence, real quickly, between a theological virtue, faith, hope, and charity, and the cardinal virtues?
Okay, well, the word cardinal comes from the Latin word for hinge, cardo. And so we have 4 powers in our soul that all go together to help to develop our freedom. And that's true not only with regard to our relationship with God, but also to each other, and also not just in the context of faith, but also in the context of reason. Because we have an intellect, we need to know what the correct action is here and now. Because we have a will, we need to desire it. And then traditionally, according to our philosophy that we follow, we have 2 different emotional experiences, one of which is to approach a good or avoid an evil when it's hard to do that, and the other is pleasure and pain and joy and sorrow. So if we're going to have total freedom in our living of our moral life, St. Thomas was of the opinion, and he followed Aristotle in this, that you have to look at the good first, what the perfection is of your powers and how they go together, in order to understand the weaknesses. Now, many of the documents of our church use 10 Commandments and sin as a reference. Well, that's fine, it's scriptural.
Yeah.
But regarding the proper understanding, if you're trying to do a science of what's involved in freedom, it's like trying to discuss illness without knowing what health is. So you begin with what the healthy aspect is of your freedom being totally formed, which means that what you know, what you love, and your passions all go together in one great action. And that's what the idea of the cardinal virtues is. So when St. Thomas approaches discussions of sin, he first starts with the virtues.
Exactly, and that's and these virtues are not the same as the theological. The theological virtues require the grace of God.
Right. The theological virtues are about our relationship with God alone, really,
Right.
even though, of course, charity does include loving our neighbor as
But it begins with love of God,
Right.
because He loved us first.
Right. But the cardinal virtues have to do with our relations with each other.
Exactly.
And they are important because, we also receive infused cardinal virtues, if you want to put it that way, when we're baptized. We're lucky we don't have to develop them like non-Christians do. We receive them when we're baptized because the relationship of charity does demand also our attitude in everyday life with the people we know, love, and serve.
Now so the folks can, we got a general sense here. Let's get a little more concrete. So which is your favorite virtue to start, cardinal virtue to start off with?
Well, I think it's funny, we talked about that on the show. And for me, it's fortitude.
That doesn't surprise me one bit.
Courage.
Especially the way I preach. Because I believe in St. Paul, Ephesians 4:15, the truth in love, but it's going to be the truth. Because Jesus says the truth sets you free. Free to do what? Free to be the person that God created you to be. And the thing that people need to realize is that the relativism, the things of the culture that we talked about earlier, those actually enslave you. They think it's making you free, but it's actually enslaving you. And it's this desire to cooperate with the grace and cooperating with these virtues and living out these virtues that actually make you free. And that's what we try to get across. But you need courage in today's culture to live that.
And I always tell folks, if you don't believe us that these enslave, don't ask me. Go to an AA meeting. Go to a Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Anonymous, Eaters Anonymous, and see how enslaving gluttony, drugs, sex, and alcohol can be. And listen to those folks to find out what that slavery is like and that you're not getting freedom in this. But now I'll ask you the same question. What is your favorite?
Well, I don't really have one. I will say the traditional order, of course, is the most important one is Prudence. And you know, the Catechism uses the image of a charioteer. You think of the Ben-Hur horse race?
Yes.
You have the will and all these passions all wanting to run, but Prudence sits there and has to guide them into where they're going in their direction. The ancients believed the most important virtue was justice, because good men were chiefly known by their attitude of justice toward others. And you know, we were talking about this in the series. People's idea of justice today is, I get my rights. That has nothing to do with what we traditionally refer to as justice. Fine, it's good for you to have your rights, but you develop the virtue of justice when you give another person their rights, and that's your duty. And we all talk about rights, but not about duties. So the virtue of justice isn't so much about you getting your rights, it's about giving rights to others. It's always other-oriented.
See, that's one of the things that you don't hear the various political speeches bring out. They emphasize my rights to this, that, but the other side of rights are always duties. That's why something like animal rights is an absurdity, because animals are not capable of performing duty.
Right.
They can follow their instinct, they can follow training if they're a trained animal, but that's it.
Well, you can
they
be
don't
cruel
have
to an
duties.
animal, but you can't be unjust.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. Cruelty to an animal is absolutely
terrible.
wrong,
Right.
but to introduce justice talk and rights talk when it's impossible without duties, that's what people, and if it doesn't apply to animals, you have to think about that in everything else. What are your duties? If you say you have a right to food, what is your duty of sharing it?
Absolutely.
If you have a right to an education, what is your duty to sharing it?
Well, the same with property. You have a right to private property, but you have a duty to develop it for the good of others.
Exactly. And then, so we've got justice, we've got prudence. He likes those two. You got fortitude. What else you got?
Well, the last one is temperance. You know,
And that means?
We talked about temperance.
Women walking around with a sign.
Right, we talked about
bashing
that.
up barrels of beer.
Carrie Nation. Yeah.
No, see, we have fun. That's why we work together so well, because we like to have a lot of fun. But we talked about temperance, and one of the examples we give for that is because all these work together. It's not like, oh, I have to work on prudence. Now tomorrow I have to work on courage. Now I have to work, but how they all work together. And so by the time we got to temperance, we looked at how all of the virtues started to work together. And the example we gave for temperance is, managing the, because pleasure is not a bad thing. God gives us pleasure at a very base level, at a very instinctual level, if you will, because that helps raise our mind and our heart to God. And the example I used in the series was, I give my wife chocolate sometime. Not too much, because then she'll think I'll try to get her fat or something, but just to give her a little box of chocolates. And when she bites into the chocolates, oh God, that's good. Yeah. Because the pleasure of that experience raised her mind and heart to God. The problem in our culture today is that under the influence, I believe, of Satan, because he's trying to destroy covenant relationship with God, he's taken pleasure out of its proper context as a means to an end and pulls it out and holds it up in the culture. Now pleasure becomes an end in itself. Pleasure becomes your God. And temperance is the virtue that helps us to moderate the way we respond to these stimuli and these pleasures in our life. And so we talked about internet pornography, for example, and how to overcome that.
It's somewhat, the analogy I like to have everybody begin with in terms of temperance. Your stomach is made to digest food. Your palate is made to taste it, partly to see if the food is bad. That's a very basic use of, but also to encourage you to eat more of food that is good. But now we have people who call themselves foodies, because for them it's going from taste to taste without real concern that the digestive process is the goal for the nourishment of my body. That's what the stomach can do. And that the palate is an aid to getting you to eat what you need. The same, if you can begin to see that, which is not easy in a society where gluttony is a big issue, then you can see that there's also sexual gluttony. You know, that's where pornography, sexual pleasure was meant to be good, but sexuality is oriented towards procreation of children. Just like the stomach has its purpose, the heart has its purpose, sexuality has its purpose, and being able to be temperate is balance. Would that be?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And what's happened, we live in a culture that, we say, if it feels good, do it.
Right.
So there's no, it's
Back
very
in the 60s when you were young.
That's true. Who remembers that long, huh?
Yeah, we
Even
do.
the young priests constantly tell me that. So. Well, there's a balance, as you know, because you're a confessor. Because our passions and our pleasures often lead us to sin, there are some Christians who believe, like the Stoics did, that we should become totally unfeeling. We should never have them.
People have no pleasure at all.
Well, people will come and say, I did this as a sin. I said, no, it isn't. But Father, I enjoyed it. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It depends on what you enjoy. So that's
and how much.
Right. And see, that's not too much our problem today. That was our problem before Vatican II. Everybody felt guilty about feeling anything. I always use that nun in the Song of Bernadette. My lips are parched from constant prayer. My eyes burn like the very fires of hell. From lack of sleep, I will not give them. And this is kind of a spiritual perfection. Now, in the 60s, I remember, see, you don't because you're too young.
No, I'm not.
In 1968 at Berserkly, they all discovered feelings, and then it became feelings, whoa, feelings. But we need to have a balance between the two, and that's where the truth enters. And not only that, but the virtues also emphasize very much for us that morality is not an exterior imposition of some law that makes us a slave. Exactly. That we have to interiorize the truth of our nature by our practice. And in religious life, we used to talk about interiorizing the rule. You could do what people tell you to without any desire or any knowledge because you're afraid. But if the thing is good for you, you want it to enter into your soul and make you whole and have integrity and form you about that.
Right. And this is one of the thing about the virtues, as you're describing them, is that they evoke from us a need to think about these virtues. For instance, there are a lot of very conservative politicians who are now calling themselves libertarians, and they want to be free from the constraints of government, and they talk about that as their form of justice, but they still don't emphasize the role of their duties.
Right.
It's always, the government doesn't have a right to tell me I cannot kill myself. They don't have a right to tell me I can't use marijuana. And all of that is still missing. For instance, thinking through justice, right, as duty as well as rights. And these libertarians are just going way off, on this, and this is a big problem. It sounds attractive. So.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Sin is attractive.
Yes, it is.
I know
that.
And that's why the virtues help us to navigate, because again, it's the truth that frees us. It's sin that enslaves us. Mm-hmm. But when a culture tells you that sin is good, evil is good, and you start to buy into that, mm-hmm. And now you're working against those things that are trying to actually free you.
See, yeah, and like you said, there's a relativism in the culture that there is no such thing as good or evil. You know, who can define it? There's no such thing as truth.
Well, that may be good for you, but that's not good for me.
Well, see, and then that goes to the point that after you start to accept that, then you move. Well, my pleasures are my rights, and the pleasures out of any kind of order are rights. So that my right to have pornography in public places is now stronger than my right to say a prayer in public places. That's where the law's gone.
Well, and of course, it also in our society, we've completely undercut the traditional distinction of the origin of rights, which is between natural rights and rights that the community gives you by the Constitution or whatever, positive rights. Because today, many people have the idea everything's positive right. There are no natural rights. I remember when Clarence Thomas became a Supreme Court justice, he mentioned the natural law, and they practically laughed him out of the court.
They've done that a few times to him. You know, that's exactly right. But what would be the basis of natural rights? When you talk about a natural right, what is the basis of that?
Well, it's the human soul. And again, that's what's questioned today. Many people think we're just a more developed animal. We don't have a spiritual soul. But people like Plato and Aristotle, many philosophers believed that man had this divine spark in him that was better or different or went beyond materialism. But we live in a materialistic culture. So the whole idea that we have, and it's been traditionally a part of our thinking for thousands of years, not just Christian or Judeo-Christian thinking, but philosophy, is the soul. And the fact that we have a spiritual part of us means that we can't be manipulated or used by other people to their ends. There's certain things about us, like life, the right to marriage, the right to an education, that sort of thing, that have to be respected in any social context. And you remember, of course, the famous origin of the idea of this is the play Antigone, where in the Greek drama, the two brothers, one was the king of Thebes, the other was his brother. The king was a tyrant, the brother was a good man. They had a civil war and killed each other. And the regent that took over decreed that the legitimate king could be buried, but the rebel, even though he was a good man, had to be left, his body to be eaten by the carrion. Well, in defiance of the law, their sister Antigone buries her brother. And she says, there's a law of the gods that's much older and more powerful than your human law, that no one may deny. And that's what I have reference to. Well, that means there's objective truth about us that has to be respected if we're going to have good societies. And of course, abortion attacks the most basic right, which is the right of innocent life.
And this is, you know, something that we don't see brought out in literature today. The literature goes for the superficial. I mean, some of the most popular literature would be novels like Harry Potter,
Right.
or Da Vinci Code and things like that. Those are very popular, and others that are less than that, but not so many pieces of literature bring out those fine issues like Antigone to get us to think, wait a minute, Antigone has a point here, you know, and that we need to think about. And we don't see that kind of thought, which is necessary for these cardinal virtues.
You know, one example I use when I talk with teenagers about this is, you know, you talk about the culture. Well, before the dystopian era,
What's dystopia mean?
you know, that's the movies like Hunger Games and that type of genre, futuristic. You know, it's like it's a future, but it's a future that goes back to more of a primitive way of living. But this is happening in the future.
It's the opposite of utopia, where things are getting better. Dystopia is it's declining back towards barbarity.
Yes, yeah. And so before that, you know, the big genre that people were into, like the girls, for example, is the vampires.
Yes.
You know, and then for the guys, it was the zombies, which is still pretty popular for guys. I mean, video games, books, movies. And I asked myself, why are those two things very popular? So you have to ask yourself.
Absolutely.
Vampires and zombies are both dead, but yet they're alive. Now, what do they have to do to stay alive? What does a zombie have to do? Eat flesh. What does a vampire have to do? Drink blood. So what they're craving in their hearts in this natural law that says do good and avoid, the fundamental principle of synderesis, right? Do good and avoid evil. They're craving flesh and blood. But because they are not learning how to use these cardinal virtues, because the chariot is going wherever it wants to go because the culture's steering it, they're trying to find flesh and blood in creatures that are dead, that can't give them anything. So women are, when they like a romance, it's a vampire biting her in the neck. And that's romance, and turns her into a vampire so they can live together forever. You know, but what it's reaching for is heaven. What they're reaching for is the transcendent. What they're searching for is the supernatural, and they're not finding it in the culture. When in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, they can eat the true flesh and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ and live forever. And that's why we need to live with these virtues, because that steer us always in the direction of truth, who is a person, Jesus Christ.
See, and this is where both the zombie and the vampire genres are pseudo-resurrections that are demonic distortion of the beauty of Jesus Christ raised from the dead. And it's a distortion, like you said, of the Eucharist. Instead of Christ giving his body and blood to drink for us to have eternal life, they take your life by eating your flesh or drinking your blood. This is the demonic distortion.
And this is why we need the virtues. Exactly why, because everything will get steered off course, because the culture is the one that's determining things. When we have to, and that's why I love doing this with Father Mullady, because he brings this wonderful intellectualism, which we're missing. Because everybody wants to feel everything and nobody wants to think.
I mean, this is, where the Dominicans are so good at preserving Thomas.
Yes.
And the insights that he, we need to gain that way of thought. I don't know if I ever told you this in the past, but in days when I was doing some cult, helping people, get out of cults. We didn't, do anything to kidnap anybody, but the folks who voluntarily want to get out of a cult, the best ways to get them to get out of the cult thinking was to study Thomas or the law, because both taught you how to think logically.
Right.
Yes.
And this is what we need to understand the law, and we need to understand Thomas.
Right, absolutely.
Well, the thing is, and you look at what's going on in high schools, and I have 2 daughters in high school, so Catholic high schools is what I'm talking about. When they're learning about the faith, they're learning it like a subject in school. They're comparative religions, and they may take a Christology course, but it's all mostly academic.
Yes.
There's nothing there that moves them to a deeper intimacy with Jesus Christ. They're not learning Thomas. They're not learning apologetics, which apologia, which means to defend. What they did back in the time of the philosophers, they defended the faith, and that's a good thing. And they're not learning how to do this, not learning how to think through this to make the connection between the head and the heart. And that's one of the reasons why we did this virtue, to help people make those connections so they can actually live the way that Christ calls each of us to live.
And in a culture like ours, where we see that so many people don't learn these processes of thinking, they don't learn how to reason their way through. The danger is, plus they also don't know much data. We see this over and over again. 1 out of 6 students who took a national test on civics was able to pass the test. They don't understand our culture. They don't understand our government. They don't know who the vice president is. They usually know the president, but the vice president, they have no idea. And this endangers people to be manipulated by demagogues. The politicians become manipulators and not leaders. And they do it usually for their own evil purposes. All right, we are going to take a break. We're going to come back. We want to get some of your questions and your comments, as well as those of our studio audience, so please stay with us. Thank you. Welcome back. First of all, I want to invite you to do what all these nice people have done, including 4 very sweet daughters who brought their mom over here for Mother's Day. Now, isn't that nice? And wouldn't you like to do something like that for your mom or your dad for Father's Day or one of these other holidays? So come on and come as a family, come as a parish. We'd love to have you. Just contact our pilgrimage department at 205-271-2966 or go to EWTN.com and they will get you information about scheduling of masses, programs. You can be in the audience, or tours of the network and places to stay near here or near Huntsville, and good places to eat, because this is Alabama. Your mama used to live down in Montgomery, and they had some good fried green tomatoes down there and here too. So come on down. You all ready for some questions?
Yes.
Yeah, you better be, because they're coming in. Well, let's start off with James. Hello, James.
Hello.
Hi, where are you from?
Pennsylvania.
Well, great to have you. And what is your question?
Can there ever be a real conflict between natural virtues and supernatural virtues? For example, if someone's called to be a martyr, die for Christ, would their natural prudence say no, but supernatural prudence say yes, die for Christ? How would you resolve that kind of apparent conflict?
Well, it's funny. We talked about that on the series, and you gave such an eloquent response. I will let you answer.
Try it again.
Try
it again.
Well, natural prudence only has its limitations according to things in this world. And it isn't so much a conflict, but the issue would be what the truth is that you are experiencing. The chief act of the virtue of fortitude is martyrdom, because there's nothing you love more than your life. But of course, the only thing that you'd be able to die for really as a martyr would be something that's worth more than your life, and that could only be God, the truth of God. So it isn't exactly there's a conflict between the two, but there's a higher standard for supernatural prudence than there is for natural prudence. And any person who experiences supernatural prudence would then form their judgments according to that standard. Now, if a person wasn't baptized and didn't have supernatural prudence, martyrdom would seem to be something that's almost completely illogical to them.
It's absurd.
Yeah. So it isn't exactly there's a conflict. It's that when you see it from a higher perspective, which is God's perspective, and especially, we don't rush to martyrdom. Most people don't. Sometimes people are given the grace of martyrdom. He was talking about Ignatius of Antioch during the series, who said, "Don't keep me from it." But normally, it's not something you presume on. It's something God brings you to, and he gives you the grace to do that. I'm always reminded of the line in The Man for All Seasons where Thomas More tries to get out of answering the questions about the king's acts of succession. And he says to his daughter, God made us to serve us in the tangle of his mind. If I can take the oath, I will, because this is not the stuff of which martyrs are made. And of course, God calls him to martyrdom, and he realizes that. So I wouldn't say there's exactly a conflict, but what I would say is, since faith and grace are more powerful than nature, and of course they also involve another perspective, what we do is form our prudence according to that. And
certainly throughout the history of the church, there have been quite a number of saints whose lives were in danger. As a matter of fact, last month we had the feast of St. Catherine of Siena. And when her life was in danger, she hoped that she would be martyred.
Right.
But, that didn't happen in Florence.
Wasn't God's will. No.
Yeah, and, there are a number of martyrs who hid for a prudence that they knew they could wait and then go on and be around to serve others. But when it came to a point, you cannot escape this.
Right.
Then they were willing to lay down their
lives. It's God's
lives.
part, not ours, to bring us to that.
Yes, yes. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Aurora, Indiana.
Good to have you here.
Thank you.
And what is your question?
Well, I'd like to know from Deacon Harold, what do you think could be done to fill in this gap that you say is not being done in the Catholic high schools now, so that the students will learn to think and process things like the cardinal virtues?
Well, one of the things is actually make the schools Catholic. Archbishop Cordialone in San Francisco is getting skewered right now because he is not afraid. He's exercising the virtues here, especially Fortitude, because he's trying to make the schools Catholic. There are a few bishops that around the country that I consider friends. One of them is Bishop Warfel in Great Falls Billings Diocese. And
in Montana.
In Montana. He's invited me there several times, and every time I go there, he wants me to speak at the high schools. And what he started to do was actually have Catholic apologetics taught at the high schools, so that these young people can learn not just what about the faith, what, but why, how to think about their faith. And make that deeper connection at the high school level between the head and the heart. So it's not just a matter of when someone walks up to you and say, you guys worship Mary, how do you respond to that? Okay, well, that's fine to be able to give an answer, but what does that have to do with your life, and how does that deepen your faith and your intimacy with God? How does that foster intimate, personal, loving, and life-giving communion? So all of that has to go together, the connection between the head and the heart. And I think that Bishop Warfel, I'm sure others, are doing that, and that's what we need to do. Now, we also, though, need to do that at home, because we have to remember Catholic schools, youth group, all that stuff in the parish, those are wonderful, but those are there to support what we're supposed to be doing at home. Mm-hmm. So the parents have to live this out, and the parents have to also learn about the faith so they can pass that on to their children.
It's on that last point, makes a huge difference if parents, especially if the father, helps kids with their homework. That if the dad helps the kids with the homework, almost certainly they'll have B's and A's. Now, if it's worth doing for mathematics, history, social studies, and everything else, then how much more to make sure that your child gets to heaven, and that you get to heaven because you helped your child get there.
Exactly.
And training them in the faith so that they do not look on confirmation as your graduation from Catholic education.
Exactly.
You're done with, I got confirmed, so I don't have to go to study anymore.
Check.
You know everything?
Yep.
Well, and as you know, many of the people complain, not only in the Catholic high schools, but in the religion programs. The parents drop the kids off. They never take them to Mass. They expect us to, it's a magic act, I guess, where we tell them that they're supposed to do this, but then it's not do as I do as I say, and they don't themselves support it by practice.
And that's where I was at a parish in helping out in Franklin, Tennessee, back in the 80s, and I was in grad school. And the pastor there had 400 to 500 adults going to adult ed classes, while the kids were going to catechism. Right. And so that this was the parish example, and he was able to motivate people. This is what we have to do.
That's excellent.
We have John on the line. Hello, John.
Oh, Father?
Yes, where are you from?
I am from Ohio.
And your question?
My question is for the group, but maybe particularly for Father Mullady. Based on your discussion tonight on moral virtues, and I would say also natural law, make a concise argument for us why artificial birth control is wrong.
Okay, so why is artificial birth control against natural law?
As you very well pointed out, you have to examine the body and what the physical actions of the body are and how they relate to the giving of the soul. And the purpose of marriage is children. Also, the unity of the parties. The unity of the parties is a special unity of love that turns around the giving of life. As you know, life has been separated from marriage today. It's one of the reasons why same-sex marriage is pushed. As soon as you separate the giving of life from marriage, you do it violence. Obviously, the sexual act, that's the purpose, is to bring forth life. And so, of course, now we're not animals, it's true. We choose and we exercise. but we don't artificially try to preclude the gifts that God himself wishes to give in this, because God himself, we believe, creates the soul. And as a result, the whole contraceptive act becomes an act in which you sacrifice one of the good goods of marriage on the altar of the other. In other words, you sacrifice procreation and education for the sake of unity. As soon as you do that, you deny the Creator his rights. He has rights too in this. You take away our duties to experience the depths of love, and you also make the act manipulative. And I have one of the psychiatrists I follow maintains that contraception itself robs people of the duties and responsibilities of love, and as a result, it makes them easy victims to both evil and to their own weak inclinations, and they have no backbone, your problem, no backbone and courage anymore. So he believes that in World War II, for example, France, which took the leadership in the contraceptive actions in the French, it began all the way back in the French Revolution, that one of the reasons they had such difficulty dealing with the Nazis was because their youth had been sapped of courage. And not only that, but there's if you want to look this up, it's chilling to watch. On YouTube, there's a 1-minute video of Margaret Sanger, the founders of Planned Parenthood, made by Pathé British News in 1947. And she has just said that the solution to the socioeconomic problems of Europe after World War II is no one should have any babies for 10 years in Europe. The interviewer says, well, don't you think this is a radical solution? She says, well, it might seem radical to some people, but to me it's the only way. And then I had to laugh at this. The interviewer says, but you know, at the moment in our country, in England, childbearing is the only thing that isn't taxed and regulated. And you want to take this away? And she says, well, I guess everyone should make their decision on this for themselves. However, and she looks right in the camera, she says, as for me, I will say no more babies.
Yep.
It's anti-people. And not only that, but God wants the people heaven. That's why he allows us to have children. So it's heaven as well.
It's something that, also was very much, she was into a very racist approach
Eugenics
toward
too.
life. She, in Planned Parenthood, collaborated with the Nazis in 1935 to promote eugenics, get rid of the undesirables. She's the one who said black people are weeds that have to be removed. Right. You see where this starts to go, and that you go to places someplace like New York City. I've just recently heard that 85% of black children conceived get aborted. It becomes, it goes down the line, for horrendous things.
And what is astonishing is when the new mayor took over, he said there weren't enough abortion clinics in New York City.
Yeah. And also it objectifies the other person too. Contraception turns that other person into an object for pleasure and gratification that strips them of their humanity, that strips them of their dignity as a person. They no longer see that person in the image and likeness of God. The end of Genesis 2 says they were naked and not ashamed because they were seeing each other through God's eyes. They were looking at each other the way God sees them. And contraception strips you of that. Now, natural family planning, they say, is the Catholic version of contraception. But in natural family planning, you choose not to act. You actually use what God has designed. There's only a couple of days a month that a woman can get pregnant. You choose not to act during those days. You choose to do nothing, not something.
Well, as a matter of fact, you could even say you use the virtue of temperance.
There you go.
You practice temperance according to the rights of the Creator, who himself has placed the infertility.
Exactly.
I was wondering when the one guy between the three of us who's married is going to speak up.
Right.
Well, let's take another question from our studio. It's, ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Colorado Springs.
Right, and your question?
And my question is, how does a parent deal with an adult child that was brought up in a Christian home and Christian values and principles, and then they go to college and they are in a stage of questioning, where the professors are very liberal, the government is very liberal, and how does a parent love the child through those stages? How does a parent help them? Because at that stage, it's very difficult.
It is, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't call a lot of the professors liberal. They are antagonistic to God and especially to religion. And I would also add that professors have become extremely closed-minded towards God. They close down authentic discussion and logic, and they want to just do what they want, as propaganda. Just recently, a woman was threatened with expulsion from graduate school because she would not deny her faith in Jesus Christ. Graduate school. So, what do we do with this situation? What are your suggestions?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think one with these, and both of you were college professors, so
Yes,
you have a probably different perspective than me. But what I see is you're exactly right. The approach that these professors take, and in the name of academic freedom. So in their mind, faith is a hindrance to real learning, because unless you can see, taste, touch, measure, quantify something, then it's not real.
And of course, they take that principle on faith.
Yeah, that's the ironic part of the whole thing. And so they bring this philosophy into the classroom. And so that's why it's so important to have this kind of thing that Father Mullady is talking about, grounding in these virtues, understanding the whys of our faith. So when you go into an environment like that, you'll be able to think your way through. The problem is when these kids get to college, they just think they take in whatever the professor says, because this person has a PhD and they're really smart and they want to get a good grade.
Well, the other thing is they become afraid of flunking out because they dare to disagree, or they get ridiculed in public among their peers by the professors who use ridicule and propaganda instead of teaching them how to think. And this is the situation.
They have to learn how to question. When they're hearing something that says, that doesn't sound right, they need to be able to question that and to be able to reach out and say, for example, my nephew went, I don't know how to say where, but he was at a Catholic university, and he called me and said, Uncle Harold, he said, they're teaching us about Jesus wasn't really God, and Constantine turned him into God, and the Edict of Milan in 313, the 4th century, you have to strip away all the divinity to get to the real Jesus, like Jesus Seminar type of stuff. So I said, don't worry, buddy. So I literally grabbed books off my shelf, put them in a box and mailed them to him. I said, start reading this stuff, to help him think his way through what he's being taught at this institution.
And I would say in general, that, I'm getting a number of books I will be talking about on my other programs in the future of how to defend the existence of God through the use of physics and biology. Great people like Dr. Anthony Rizzi, himself a very fine physicist, using physics and Thomas and Aristotle to defend the existence of God and explain it's done without the existence of God. Existence is dumb, physics is dumb. And the same thing with DNA. That's all information. Who came up with it? We think the computer is so interesting. That's only a binary system. DNA has 4 elements that are interacting. It's far more complex than a computer. Did the computer exist by itself? These are the things that we'll be discussing some more, because we've got to do that. And I recommend for your kids who are graduating high school, get them a copy of God Is Not Dead, the movie, and watch it with them to prepare them for this nonsense, that when they hear foolish professors use propaganda instead of thought and that they can detect that. Let's go to another question. Hello, Chris.
Yes.
Hi, where are you from?
Hi, I've been looking for some suggestions on meditative prayer that align with the Catholic teaching. I obviously don't want to go toward the New Age Eastern route.
Good.
And I've heard of contemplative prayer and also the book, A Cloud of Unknowing. Are those good tools to get started, or do you have better recommendations?
I wouldn't recommend Cloud of Unknowing to get started because it's very hard to understand.
Right.
The books I always recommend to my directees are Divine Intimacy, which is a 4-volume, it's available from Ignatius Press, meditation on a day of the year, a page for each day of the year, which on Sundays includes the readings from the liturgy by Father Gabriel of St. Mary Magdalene, and then also the excellent book on Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, The Fire Within by Father Dubé, which is also available for Ignatius Press. Those are excellent books to get started with. And if you, the Opus Dei series, In Conversation with God for Laymen, but there are many, many volumes to that. They're small, but they're very good meditations too, to help the laity to begin meditation. And
I can, if I might also add, there's a very fine little book called How to Listen When God is Speaking. I wrote that.
By you. That's right.
But as a matter of fact, it is meant as a starter for prayer.
Right.
You know, it's meant very much for the beginner. And that a lot of people have found it clear and useful. That would be good, as well as a brand new one I just did of meditations on the beginning of the life of Christ's public ministry. So.
And I would say go to adoration,
Yep.
a Eucharistic adoration. And what I do is I take the Psalms and I pray the Psalms during adoration.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
they're so personal. I mean, I have not found any aspect of my life, any feeling that I've had that was not contained in the Psalms.
Yep.
Beautiful
and
reflections.
as a Dominican on the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, I have to also recommend the Rosary.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Please, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Let's go now to Bill. Hello, Bill.
Hi, Father Mitch.
Hi, where are you from?
I'm from near the Buffalo, New York area, and I met you at Scotiabank Convention Center last year.
Oh, great. And what's your question?
It's for Father Mullady. I was listening to his homily this morning. I thought he said Catholicism is the most reasonable religion on the face of the earth.
I said
because
intelligent
it's the
religion.
only religion that believes that faith and reason can be reconciled with each other. And I just wanted him to explain that a little bit more.
I got a minute.
I said it was the most intelligent religion on the face of the earth because we're the only religion that believes that what the pagan philosophers taught, you can find truth in everything, and as witnessed in people like, beginning with Justin the Apologist, but all the people, especially St. Thomas Aquinas, all through, Augustine, Ignatius, the Carmelite, everybody believes that the truth which human beings can discover by reason alone has its origin in the Holy Spirit. In your question on the universities, Alan Bloom wrote a book in the 1980s, a secular book called The Closing of the American Mind.
Yes.
And in this book he said the one thing that universities are not interested in today is objective truth. Any objective truth, even one taught by a pagan philosopher like Aristotle, has its origins ultimately in the Holy Spirit because God, the light by which we even know reason, has its origin in God. Of course, it's not as deep as the light of faith, which is where we enter into God's nature itself.
But it's a good help.
Good.
And one of the great things about having reason is that we can come up with clocks that let us know we've run out of time. And I appreciate you both being here and doing this series. Look forward to it very much. And Father Mullady, if you would join me in giving a blessing to our audience, may Almighty God bless you and cause His face to shine upon you, lead you in all of your ways, and guide you by His peace. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And may the intercession of our Blessed Mother of Fatima be with you as well. And again, we can do this new mini-series as well as this program and all the other shows only because this network is brought to you by you. We don't advertise, we don't sell advertising. It is your generosity that keeps us on the air. So please keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill. And God willing, we'll be able to pay all of our bills every month too. Thank you.